It was a quiet Saturday morning in the peaceful neighborhood of Maplewood, the kind of place where retirees tended their gardens and kids rode their bikes without a care in the world. But then a shrill voice shattered the calm. "Excuse me. Excuse me. What is this nonsense?" Karen stood at the edge of the lake, her arms crossed so tightly it seemed like she was trying to squeeze the air out of herself. Her signature short blonde bob, sprayed into an immovable helmet, trembled in rage as she pointed an accusatory finger at the offending body of water. The lake. A lake that had existed long before Maplewood HOA, long before Karen had appointed herself queen of the neighborhood. A lake that, in her mind, had absolutely no business being there. You live around here, right? Who authorized this?" she screeched, whirling toward a man who had been peacefully fishing. The man blinked in confusion, his fishing rod in one hand and a half-eaten sandwich in the other. What? This lake. It's not on the official HOA property map. Who gave it permission to exist?" The man looked at the lake, then back at Karen. I think God." Wrong answer. Karen gasped like he had just suggested setting the whole neighborhood on fire. She turned on her heel and stormed toward the nearest house, muttering about bylaws and unauthorized bodies of water. She had fought against plastic flamingos, string lights, and rogue basketball hoops, but this was her biggest battle yet. Back at her house, Karen pulled out her massive HOA rulebook and started flipping furiously. She prided herself on knowing every single clause, every ridiculous fine she could slap on her neighbors. But there was nothing about lakes that made her angrier. If it wasn't explicitly allowed, then it was obviously against the rules. That was Karen logic. By noon she had fired off a dozen emails to the HOA board, demanding that something be done about the lake. Nobody responded immediately, which only fueled her rage. She stomped outside again, determined to find more allies in her crusade. She spotted Mrs. Thompson watering her azaleas. "Did you know there's a completely unauthorized lake behind our houses?" Karen snapped as if she had just discovered a crime scene. Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her 70s who had lived in Maplewood long before Karen, sighed. "Yes, dear. It's always been there." "Well, we need to do something about it. What if someone drowns? What if mosquitoes start breeding? This is a catastrophe waiting to happen." Mrs. Thompson gave her a look usually reserved for children throwing tantrums in grocery stores. "Karen, it's a lake. It's not going to pack its bags and leave just because you don't like it." Karen gritted her teeth. If the HOA wouldn't do anything and the neighbors were too lazy to care, she had only one option left: the police. At precisely 1:32 p.m., Karen dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report an illegal body of water," she announced the moment the dispatcher picked up. Pause. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Could you clarify? There is a lake behind our neighborhood. It's unauthorized, it's a hazard, and I demand that something be done about it." Another pause. "Ma'am, are you reporting water?" Karen bristled. "It's not just water. It's an unregistered lake. It's dangerous, and I demand that you send someone to investigate before something terrible happens." The dispatcher, undoubtedly questioning their career choices, sighed and agreed to send an officer just to get this woman off the phone. 30 minutes later, Officer Martinez pulled up in his squad car, looking about as unenthusiastic as a person could possibly be. He had been a cop for 10 years. He had handled everything from rowdy teenagers to full-on robberies. But never, not once, had he been called to arrest a lake. Karen marched up to him like she was the CEO of law enforcement. "Finally. Thank goodness you're here. Now the lake is right this way. I assume you brought whatever equipment is necessary to remove it." Officer Martinez blinked. "Ma'am, we don't remove lakes." Karen huffed. "Then fine it. If I parked my car on HOA property without permission, I'd be fined. This lake is just sitting there, completely unpermitted." Martinez stared at her, then turned to look at the lake. It rippled in the afternoon sun, completely indifferent to Karen's vendetta. He pinched the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, you can't fine a lake." "Oh, so lakes just get to break the law?" "The lake isn't breaking the law." "Well then, who is responsible for it?" "I want to speak to the owner." "Mother Nature." Karen was livid. "So you're telling me that I, a taxpayer, have no say in whether or not this hazardous, unauthorized puddle sits in my neighborhood?" Martinez, regretting every life decision that led him to this moment, sighed. "Ma'am, unless this lake is committing a crime, There's nothing I can do. Karen's jaw clenched. I knew you cops were lazy. This is why crime is out of control. Next thing you know, this lake will be. Before she could finish, a loud explosion echoed from behind her. A group of neighborhood kids had just cannonballed into the water, laughing and cheering as they splashed around. Karen whirled around, her eyes widening in horror. Oh my God. It's harboring criminals. Martinez took a deep breath, clenching his fists at his sides to stop himself from face-palming too hard. They're kids, ma'am. Swimming. In a lake. Which is what lakes are for. Karen turned back to him, voice shrill with outrage. I will not stand for this lawlessness. If the police won't do their job, I will take care of this myself. Martinez gave her a long, tired look. I strongly advise against that. Karen ignored him. As far as she was concerned, she had been given no choice. If the authorities were too weak to handle this menace, she would take matters into her own hands. And that was the moment her fate was sealed. Because in her obsessive need to control everything, Karen was about to do something so spectacularly stupid, so catastrophically ill-conceived, that it would turn her into a local legend. By the time she was done, the lake would not only have its revenge, it would have its name immortalized forever. Karen stormed back to her house, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't believe the incompetence she had just witnessed. First, the HOA had ignored her complaints. Then the police had refused to take action. And to top it all off, neighborhood kids were treating the illegal lake like their personal water park. This was anarchy. She wouldn't stand for it. If no one else was going to deal with this problem, she would do it herself. She spent the next 2 hours in front of her laptop, searching for ways to remove a body of water. Most of the results were either about swimming pool drainage or government-controlled water management projects. But Karen wasn't about to let small details like science and legality stop her. She needed a solution, and she needed it fast. After several failed attempts at finding an official route, she landed on a promising idea. She would cover the lake. If she could dump enough dirt and sand into it, she could effectively bury it, turning it into a nice, dry piece of land. Maybe she could even turn it into something useful like a parking lot for the HOA meetings. It was perfect. The next morning she made some calls. She didn't bother contacting any reputable contractors because she knew they would try to talk her out of it with their nonsense about environmental laws and liability issues. Instead, she found a guy named Larry who advertised, no questions asked, hauling and dumping services. That was exactly what she needed. She told Larry she wanted to fill in some low ground on her property and paid him under the table to start hauling in loads of dirt and sand. Larry showed up that afternoon with a dump truck full of material. He took one look at the lake and scratched his head. Ma'am, this ain't exactly low ground. This is water. Karen waved him off impatiently. Yes, I know what it is. Just start dumping. Larry shrugged. He had been paid up front, and as far as he was concerned, this wasn't his problem. He backed the truck up to the edge of the water and tipped the first load of sand into the lake. It splashed, creating a murky cloud as it sank. Karen clapped her hands together, satisfied. Yes, that's it. Keep going. For the rest of the afternoon, truckload after truckload of sand was dumped into the lake. The water darkened, the shorelines shrank, and Karen felt a growing sense of victory. This was working. The lake was disappearing. Soon this whole thing would be over, and she could return to enforcing her real HOA priorities, like regulating the acceptable shades of beige for front doors. As night fell, she stood at her window, admiring her handiwork. The lake was already looking smaller. It wouldn't be long now. She went to bed feeling victorious, already planning how she would present her land reclamation project at the next HOA meeting. But nature had other plans. That night a storm rolled in. Heavy rain pounded the neighborhood, filling storm drains to capacity. The already saturated ground couldn't absorb the excess water fast enough. And Karen's brilliant plan to dump tons of sand into the lake had created a perfect recipe for disaster. The sand, instead of filling the lake as she had imagined, had formed a dam-like barrier, trapping water behind it. As the rain continued to pour, the water level rose higher and higher with nowhere to go. By morning, the consequences of her actions became horrifyingly clear. Karen woke up to the sound of frantic knocking on her front door. She groggily pulled on her robe and opened it to find Mr. Jensen, one of her neighbors, standing there with a look of pure panic. Karen, Your stupid dirt pile has flooded half the neighborhood. Karen blinked. What are you talking about? Look outside. She stepped out onto her porch and felt her stomach drop. Her backyard was underwater. Not just damp, not just muddy, completely submerged. The water had risen to the point where her entire garden had disappeared beneath the surface. The same was happening to several other houses nearby. The dam of sand had redirected the water, forcing it onto people's properties. The lake had expanded, consuming everything in its path. Horrified, she ran to the side of her house, her slippers splashing through inches of standing water. The street was a disaster. People were wading through ankle-deep water, trying to salvage patio furniture and outdoor decorations that were now floating down the road. Mrs. Thompson, who had warned her to leave the lake alone, stood at the edge of her porch with her arms crossed. Well, would you look at that? Karen spun around. This isn't my fault. Mr. Jensen nearly exploded. It's literally your fault. You blocked the lake. Karen shook her head frantically. No, this is just bad weather. This is a freak accident. But no one was buying it. More neighbors gathered, all of them glaring at her like she was the villain in a disaster movie. She tried to come up with a defense, but what could she say? She had literally tried to bury a lake. The situation grew worse by the minute. The city was called in to assess the damage, and they were not pleased with what they found. A crew of engineers and environmental officials arrived, surveying the damage with grave expressions. One of them, a man in an official-looking vest, approached Karen. "Ma'am, did you authorize the dumping of sand into this body of water?" Karen hesitated. Well, it wasn't just me. Ma'am, this is a violation of multiple environmental regulations. You've interfered with a natural waterway, caused property damage, and put the entire neighborhood at risk. We're going to have to escalate this. Karen's stomach twisted. Escalate? Yes, ma'am. The EPA has been notified. Karen's vision blurred. The EPA? The Environmental Protection Agency? Weren't those the people who handled toxic waste spills and oil disasters? The man continued. Depending on the extent of the damage, you could be looking at federal fines, possible legal action, and the cost of restoration. Karen felt her breath hitch. This wasn't a simple HOA. This was serious. She had gone from controlling the color of people's mailboxes to potentially facing federal charges. As the officials continued to take notes and issue warnings, she caught sight of her neighbors whispering to one another. Some looked angry, others amused. But one thing was clear. No one was coming to her defense. She had spent years making their lives miserable with her petty rules, her unnecessary fines, and her relentless need for control. Now karma had finally caught up to her. And worst of all, the lake wasn't just still there, it was bigger than ever. Karen stood frozen on her flooded lawn, watching as city officials, environmental inspectors, and an increasing number of news crews gathered to document the disaster she had created. The once peaceful Maplewood neighborhood was now a chaotic mess of standing water, floating debris, and furious homeowners. Some houses had basements that were already filling with water, and a few unlucky residents were attempting to pump it out with little success. Kids who had been happily playing in the lake the day before were now splashing around on what used to be driveways, laughing as if this were the greatest adventure of their lives. Meanwhile, Karen's face burned with humiliation. She had tried to eliminate the lake. Now the lake had eliminated half the neighborhood. As officials assessed the situation, Karen found herself surrounded by a circle of furious HOA members. Mr. Jensen, usually a mild-mannered man who spent his days tending to his lawn, looked like he was moments away from throwing a lawn gnome at her. Mrs. Thompson, who had warned her to leave the lake alone, stood with her arms crossed, shaking her head in smug satisfaction. Other homeowners murmured amongst themselves, some whispering about lawsuits, others wondering if this meant Karen could finally be removed from her HOA throne. Karen, desperate to regain some control, cleared her throat and attempted to adopt her usual authoritative tone. Listen everyone. This is an unfortunate event, but let's not overreact. It was a simple miscalculation. I was only trying to improve the community. Mr. Jensen practically exploded. Improve? You flooded our homes, Karen. Karen flinched but held her ground. Technically, the rain caused the flooding, not me. Mrs. Thompson let out a sharp laugh. Oh, for heaven's sake. If you hadn't dumped all that sand into the lake, none of this would have happened. You tried to fight nature, Karen, and guess what? Nature fought back. Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. Well, Karen, stop, interrupted a voice from the back of the crowd. It was Tom Wilkins, the HOA treasurer, who rarely spoke during meetings unless it was about budgeting for neighborhood events. He stepped forward, glaring at her. You've been making ridiculous rules and harassing people for years. You fine people for parking an inch outside their driveway. You send notices if someone's grass is too green. And now you've turned our neighborhood into a swamp. Enough is enough. Karen's heart pounded as she realized what was happening. The HOA was turning on her. She had spent years using their authority as a weapon, believing she was untouchable. But now she was about to learn how quickly power could be taken away. Tom crossed his arms. I think I speak for everyone when I say it's time for you to step down as HOA president. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. People who had been too afraid to speak up against Karen before were now emboldened by her downfall. Even the most passive residents, the ones who usually stayed out of HOA politics, were nodding. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You can't do that. The HOA has strict rules about leadership changes and... We already checked, interrupted Mrs. Thompson. A recall vote only needs a 2/3 majority. And looking around, I think we have it. Karen's stomach dropped. She had spent years using the HOA's rulebook as a weapon against others, but now it was being used against her. She had no allies left. No one to defend her. The HOA vote was just a formality at this point. She had already lost. And then just when she thought things couldn't get worse, the real punishment arrived. A group of city officials, accompanied by an Environmental Protection Agency officer, approached her with serious expressions. One of them, a man in a navy blue suit, held a clipboard. Ma'am, we've conducted a preliminary assessment of the damage. You knowingly tampered with a natural waterway, which has now led to extensive property damage. This is a direct violation of multiple environmental protection laws. Karen swallowed hard. But I was just trying to fix the neighborhood. The man didn't even blink. Fixing the neighborhood does not include attempting to drain a legally protected lake. You obstructed water flow and caused extensive flooding, and now you are responsible for all damages. Karen felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. I don't have that kind of money. The official handed her a thick envelope. Then you might want to contact a lawyer. Shaking, she opened the envelope and gasped. The estimated cost of cleanup and repairs was well into 6 figures. Possibly even more once all assessments were completed. Her hands trembled as she read through the list of fines, legal fees, and potential criminal charges. This wasn't just an HOA issue anymore. This was federal. A local news reporter had arrived and was now interviewing residents about the disaster. Karen could hear the headline forming: Local HOA president tries to remove a lake, destroys neighborhood instead. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the chaos, the flooded houses, the floating trash bins, and of course Karen herself, standing in the middle of it all, soaking wet and humiliated. And then, just when she thought her day couldn't get any worse, a city councilman stepped forward with a final announcement. In light of this situation, we've decided that the lake will be officially preserved as a protected natural site. He cleared his throat before adding, and due to the circumstances surrounding this incident, we've decided to rename it. Karen felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they'd name it something elegant, something that would at least make this disaster sound dignified. The councilman smiled. From this day forward, this body of water will be known as Karen Lake. The crowd erupted into laughter. Karen's face burned red as people cheered. Someone even pulled out a homemade sign that read, "Welcome to Karen Lake. No HOA rules apply." The sound of delighted laughter, mocking whispers, and celebratory high-fives filled the air. The lake wasn't gone. It wasn't shrinking. It wasn't being removed. It had won. And in the end, Karen had lost everything. She had lost her position, her power, her reputation, and now, thanks to her own arrogance, her name was permanently attached to the very thing she had tried to destroy. As the sun began to set, Karen trudged back toward her house, her soaked shoes squelching with every step. She glanced back one last time, hoping, praying, that maybe this was all some horrible dream. But there it was, sparkling under the orange glow of the sunset, its rippling surface reflecting the laughter and joy of the neighbors who no longer had to live in fear of her petty rules. Karen Lake. And for the first time in her life, Karen realized she had absolutely no control over anything anymore.